And that was it, wasn't it? He wasn't like other wizards. Hagrid had told her the story of how his pet spider, Aragog, had been suspected of the murder of a Mulborn student 50 years ago, and how, during that time, he had been forbidden to use magic. He had described how he had to learn to carry out tasks the Mole way, and how he would even do things that way now if he wasn't concentrating. It was, Cecilia realized, because he was the most non-magical wizard she'd met. "Look," said Cecilia, wiping her eyes. I'm worrying about the future. I'm worrying about things that I cannot control. I'm worrying about my own decisions, things that I cannot change, and if my choices will be affected." She smiled at Hagrid, whose jolly cheerfulness was neutralizing her asinine bitterness. "Why don't you come and have a cup of tea, once you're sent that on its way?" Cecilia nodded and hurried across the owlery, waking up an extremely sleepy owl with a start and encouraging it on its way with the package firmly in its beak. "My finest lot," said Hagrid, half an hour later. Cecilia sat forward, well further forward, as she was sitting on Fang's chair again, examining the contents of the bowl that Hagrid was excitedly proffering towards her. "The best creature for experimenting, these," he added knowledgeably. "Flobberworms," stated Cecilia, not wanting to consider the grounds on which Hagrid was basing his conclusions. "The least magical creatures, these. But interesting." He poked at one of them with his finger. "Breed like rabbits, do flobberworms. Last year I had to let most of them go. Dumbledore weren't fuming." Hagrid shook his head in apprehension. "They got into the Black Lake and the merpeople began protesting, ate all the magical effluent from Hogwarts, which damn near starved 'em. Sent a delegate to see Dumbledore, dripping all over the castle he were." His voice trailed off as Hagrid recalled his misdemeanor. "So, I can have some of these?" asked Cecilia, hopefully. "If they were barely magical, then, with any luck, any energy they might possess would not shield energy of the ingredient under scrutiny, and at the same time give measure of toxicity." "Oh, by all means, Mrs. Frobisher, by all means. Save me getting into trouble again this year. There," he added, holding a flobberworm between huge, sausage-like digits towards Cecilia, and she uncurled a palm, watching it writhe and wriggle from the warmth of her hand. "Now, your next concern is young Mr. Potter," said Hagrid, turning from the flobberworms and taking now boiled kettle from the huge hook over the fireplace. Cecilia nodded, ignoring the question of how he would know this. "Thought as much, 'cause he's who you got to make the potion for, ain't he? And he's well loved by—" "Well, he's well loved." Hagrid filled up two not particularly clean enamel mugs. "Black," said Cecilia firmly, waving her other hand towards the milk of an interesting shade of white. Hagrid jerked his head towards Cecilia before looking down at her mug as he realized she was talking about the tea, and added a couple of big splashes to his own. Handing her the cup, Cecilia nodded gratefully and recalled her last research lesson with Harry. She remembered his more than disconcerted expression when she told him that Snape would be taking over, but considering that he had spent the last fortnight with his godfather, Cecilia didn't suppose he would be very happy at the news she was back, nor at the prospect of them working together again. "No," said Cecilia, her confidence growing as the details of her plan locked into place suddenly. "But it's got to be done, and he'll just have to accept it." "That's the Cecilia Frobisher we know," declared Hagrid proudly, grinning at the flobberworms. "Listen to your new mummy," he added, addressing the creatures, and Cecilia laughed aloud for the first time in almost a week as she replaced the one in her hand back into the box. That afternoon Cecilia and her new family took their first step into a brave new world. Their magical frequency was within an appropriate range, and the corresponding amplitude turned out to be extremely low. With cautious optimism, Cecilia began to boil some water over the large fire fueled by her soon-to-be possessions. She added a vial of concentrated buttercup syrup when the water was bubbling and stirred the solution a few times. And so, my little ones, you'll be assisting me with Harry's potion, she cooed affectionately to her 36 test subjects which wriggled in Hagrid's stone pot. Once the solution had cooled, Cecilia spooned out a drop onto 2 evaporating dishes, dropping 3 worms onto each and watched them intently. A few minutes later, shaking her head and smiling wryly at her new charges, Cecilia Frobisher carefully noted the effects of buttercup syrup on flobber worms to be coughing and sputtering after 2 to 2.5 minutes exposure before recording their energy level and corresponding wavelength. Casting a willful glance at the main nursery of worms before considering the ingredient, Cecilia informed her adopted offspring that she didn't fancy their chances with the next batch either. 88,888,888. Words, as cold as nitrogen ice arrows, pierced the frozen air as Lord Voldemort spoke his will to his loyal followers. Each Death Eater stood rigid and still on his command, an unnatural pose which some were finding more than a little uncomfortable to maintain. But not enough as to disobey their master. He had been known have ordered Death Eaters to be destroyed for less than that. The words were stilted, as if their illustrious leader were in pain. It was possible, thought some. His return in the summer was inspired. However, the physiological effects were not so impressive, for where Tom Riddle had aged gradually over the years, Voldemort's return had brought back a caricature of his former self, no longer brimming with health, more afflicted from the side effects of the struggle to survive following his near annihilation almost 15 years ago. No. Voldemort held up a thin bony arm, his hand aloft, turning his palm to face the one who had interrupted. Oswald Avery's death was unfortunate, for he had long been valuable to my cause. He did my will, and as a loyal servant he will be honored here as a martyr. Voldemort fell silent, watching as the Death Eaters, as a wizard, nodded their heads deferentially. "You dare to do this?" a voice rang out, weak and broken, but defiant, from in front of Voldemort. "I did what I could. Interrogated my father. Your recommended methods killed him! ! He knew nothing." Oswald Avery Jr. raised his head from the iron-hard earth, declaring his mutiny to his former peers. Voldemort did not move, save to incline his head forward, as a man to a slight knock on the window. "I did as you commanded and sought the information you needed. But to no avail. And you, Avery's rising insubordination was quickly replaced with searing pain as Voldemort held his hand over the failed Death Eater. A stream of blue-white light emanated from the end of Voldemort's wand, traveling over his body. To a non-wizard the effect would have seemed as if the condemned Avery was being filled with thousands of volts of electricity, and in actual fact the Cruciatus curse which Voldemort had conjured silently yielded similar results. Around the spectacle the Death Eaters shuffled their feet, knowing that this punishment, though not fatal, was the closest survivable reprimand that Voldemort would mete out. That implied that Avery was still valuable to Voldemort in some way, which did not sit comfortably with at least one Death Eater. Bellatrix Lestrange stepped forward, wand raised in Avery's direction. "He is expendable," she screeched at the almost ex-Death Eater. "No information he has supplied has been relevant. He has had enough chances." She looked furiously between the Dark Lord and Avery. Voldemort looked up and at the same time ceased his torture of Avery. Bellatrix fell silent and inclined her head obsequiously. "Bellatrix, you are my most loyal servant." Voldemort's words of praise fell like iron pellets on bone. "Indeed, Oswald Avery Jr. has failed, and I am much obliged for your observation of this. However, I have further use for him in matters that I am to reveal to you all tonight." He scanned the Death Eaters in an arc, looking at each one in turn before fixing Bellatrix with a stare. "Your information has led to the opportunity for the future obliteration of moles using old magic. Because of this I instruct you, Bellatrix Lestrange, to take command of this aspect of our work. Doyle has provided the necessary mole artifacts from which the old magic can be spawned. Suddenly, he pointed towards Wormtail who, until then, had stood beside him, simpering and hanging on to every word. Jumping visibly, Wormtail stood sharply to attention. "Wormtail," intoned Voldemort. "The bag? Give it to Bellatrix, that she may begin as soon as is wizardly possible." Wormtail picked up a black woolen sack, tied at the neck that lay by his feet and with some considerable effort, both mentally and physically, made the bag sail magically through the air and land in front of Bellatrix Lestrange. "My lord!" she exclaimed, in a clearly taken aback tone of voice. "This is indeed an honor. It does not need to be said that I will not fail you." She darted glances at Avery, still prostrate on the ground, and to her left towards Lucius Malfoy. At his sister-in-law's taunt, he stepped forward. "Ah, Lucius." Voldemort turned his head slowly towards Malfoy, acknowledging his presence. "You come to bear witness of the innocence of your son, that is so very honorable." "You have failed, Lucius Malfoy," Voldemort boomed, pointing a bony finger at the proud wizard. "You and your son have most displeased me." Malfoy winced as his master spoke, his words scraping against his very soul, and he stiffened in expectation of the same severe punishment that Avery had endured. "However, it is fortunate for you that my plans have changed sufficiently that owning the book is not my main priority. Through Bellatrix's new appointment it will be retrieved, and it is the discovery revealed to me by Severus Snape that has caused the change." At the mention of Snape's name, many Death Eaters flinched. They knew Snape had been in Voldemort's bad books for some time. Now it seemed the situation had changed, and some were disappointed that they would not see their most slippery of colleagues receive retribution. "Snape and the Squib have almost completed the weapon that Dumbledore wishes to use against me. It is incomplete and its nature is not yet clear. However, he is to bring the weapon with him to our next calling in order to demonstrate its power. We will then know the true extent of our threat." "And the Squib?" Bellatrix Lestrange's words pierced the silent air. Voldemort extended a hand towards the bag that Wormtail had thrown to her feet, uncoiling a finger again. "Open it." At his command, Bellatrix stooped quickly and untied the old, filthy rope from the neck of the bag. Peering inside, she returned Voldemort's glare with confusion. "The Squib." He spat the word as if it were poison from his lips. "The Mole," he corrected, "that has been infecting our world for the last 6 months has been betrayed by one whom she had put her most faith. Cecilia Frobisher's mole permit." He held up a sheet of paper, folded into eighths by the corner so it fell open. A collective gasp of horror rippled from his followers as they whispered and muttered amongst themselves. Some of them had heard Bellatrix's diatribe at Snape's failure to remain in the moles, but few had believed it. "The Mole will soon be alone and she will make her whereabouts known to you, Lucius." Voldemort nodded to Malfoy, clicking his fingers so that the permit began to smolder. "Once that occurs, Bellatrix, you are to befriend her, make her trust you." Bellatrix Lestrange blanched, as if she was about to be sick. "You will have to act as if she is your equal." The look of disgust on Bellatrix's face showed her revulsion at the task, far more than ever she had felt when she had been taken to Azkaban 14 years ago. "My lord," she began, an edge of fear in her voice. "The task you have set me, it is most challenging." She spoke now as if addressing every Death Eater as well as Voldemort. "Every wizard knows that we are vastly superior to muggles. What if she guesses who I am? And you will rise to the challenge, Bellatrix. I know you will not fail me." He pointed to the bag again. "Within lie the necessary articles that will make your transformation complete. The Mole will not suspect you, for she doubts the very wizards who have employed her, and with the passing of days her hope will wither." The Death Eaters watched as Bellatrix removed some odd-looking clothing and accessories, picking up one or two of the items and considering them with a mixture of mystified interest and revulsion. "Tell her of Lully in the book," Voldemort continued, "and she will have no cause to distrust you. Pry what information you can from her. This will only add to our enjoyment when Snape brings her to us on the night of the attack and we watch him kill her." Voldemort held his hands up in a V of triumph. "And then?" Lucius Malfoy took a step forward. "I have seen him with her. If he had betrayed us once before in her name, my lord, then do you believe that he will be able to?" Voldemort gave an inward growling scream that made Malfoy stop dead. "Snape's loyalty is beyond question. Do you not believe that I was aware of his absence and condoned it? When changes in circumstance take place, I must act quickly." So you expected Snape to be absent?" asked Bellatrix, her tone injected with a touch of bitterness. "Naturally. He has yet to fail me, but his usefulness is soon to cease. Once he has handed over the weapon and destroyed the Muldot, he shall be of no more use to us." Then, Voldemort held up his hands once more, making the blue-white lightning course from his fingers through the air and over the body of the still prostrate Avery. "Severus Snape will die. 88,888,888. See," replied Hermione, pointing at the timetable that outlined the incredibly heavy spring term that was ahead of them. As fifth years sitting their OWLs in 6 months' time, every minute seemed to have been accounted for, as Hermione pointed out to Ron solemnly. Even Wednesday afternoons, which traditionally finished an hour earlier for sporting activities or homework club, had been filled. "What? Not another hour of transfiguration?" he asked glumly, flicking over his piece of parchment that was identical to Harry's and Hermione's and had arrived by owl as they were just leaving Grimmauld Place that morning. "Like we don't have enough glorious hours of McGonagall in a week." "Could be worse," muttered Harry. "Could be potions." "No," said Hermione, picking up a book. "Wednesday 5 is Mole Studies." "Mole Studies," chorused both Ron and Harry together. "But it isn't even an examined subject. What in heaven's name are they playing at, giving us Mole Studies in our sports hour?" Harry threw his timetable on the floor of the carriage in disbelief, just missing Crookshanks, who jumped up indignantly onto Hermione's lap and began to purr noisily. "Well, it won't be," Ron began, looking at Lesson 5 on Wednesday. "Mrs. Frobisher's teaching it," stated Hermione breezily, petting Crookshanks idly as she turned over the next page in her book. "And Lesson 3 on Thursdays. Oh, and the one on Saturday." "What?" exclaimed Harry and Ron loudly, looking at one another in horror. "Mrs. Frobisher's teaching again? We've got a lesson on Saturday." Hermione rolled her eyes, exasperated, and shook her head before glancing at the carriage door. "We got the last one," said Ginny, holding out a copy of the latest Daily Prophet. "First one of the year. What's up?" "This," moaned Ron, pointing to the 5th year's timetable. "We've lost our Wednesday Quidditch practice time." "Where are your brothers?" asked Hermione, continuing to stare through the glass. "Thought they'd be back by now." "The trolley lady ran out of snacks, so they're probably trying to scam some from somewhere else. Or someone. So who's doing it now?" "Mrs. Frobisher," intoned Harry, folding his arms and turning to face the window. "What's she's doing back, that's what I want to know." Hermione closed her book and tucked it between herself and the wooden inlay of the armrest. "If she's back, it's for a reason," began Hermione, looking between the two boys as Crookshanks departed her lap and made for the luggage rack above her head. "It means that she hasn't finished the work on your potion, Harry." "Don't know why not," continued Harry grimly. "Thought she'd handed it all over to Snape at Christmas." "If she's back," repeated Hermione impatiently, "it's for a reason." "Yes, to carry on getting off with Snape," hissed Ginny, meanly. "Ginny." Hermione gave the youngest Weasley a stern glance. "Don't be so silly. They only said that for a joke." Ginny raised her eyebrows doubtfully at Ron as Hermione turned to Harry. "You'll have to carry on with the work anyway, and she's done the most work on it. You want to work with the most qualified." Who says I have to carry on with the work? Asked Harry, indignantly. And who says she's the best? He watched Hermione play with the necklace at her neck, the one she had worn to the Hogwarts Yule Ball. She was plainly annoyed. How can you say that? Hermione looked firmly at Harry in disbelief. After she found out the link between science and magic, she spent 4 whole days and nights in the library, cancelled lessons and everything. Harry. She looked away, touching the flower pendant absently. She didn't do it for fun, you know. Hermione broke off. Not much fun for me, either, began Harry. But the way you just dismiss it like it's not important. It's to do with getting rid of you-know-who for good. Hermione leaned back in the chair and folded her arms crossly. Harry leaned forward to say something else, but Ron put his hand on his arm. I'm glad you understand it, Hermione, said Ron, diplomatically looking between Harry and Hermione. Look, after the holidays we've just had, we don't need any more of this. Harry sat back, glancing sideways at Ron. If we weren't at war, and we could talk about these things, Hermione struck up again. She'd be as famous as any of the scientists we've learned about. We know, insisted Ron, uncomfortably, unused to being the pacifier out of the 3 friends. It was usually him who was having the row with either Hermione or Harry. I still say it's because of Snape, said Ginny, looking loyally at Harry. I know you think it's because of the work she's been doing, Hermione, Ginny continued, but the amount of times you both came back to the common room at odd hours and talked about where she had been and what she'd been doing. You were in the common room? Asked Ron, aghast. Spying on me and Harry? I heard you on about the amount of time she'd spent in Snape's room, and Snape in hers. Ginny's defensive justification trailing off under the indignant glare her brother was giving her. And how would you know that unless you'd been following her, spying? Ginny intoned the last word, mocking her brothers just before. Now it was Ron's turn to be defensive as the twins and Hermione looked between him and Harry. Ginny sat back in her chair, folding her arms smugly. Some might say we were spying, said Ron evasively, looking at Harry who was slumped against the carriage window now. Others might say we were looking out for Harry's interests. Still, seems dodgy. And he took her to the Yule Ball. He stared at Hermione, looking for confirmation. You told us that, Harry joined in. They were done up to the nines, you said. Ron nodded in agreement. Why would they do that if they didn't fancy each other? He added. You've changed your tune, commented Ginny, cheekily to her brother. Ron shot her a look. They went to the Order Ball together. Hermione, she added, as if that explained it. Well, some people might say that about us, Ron. And we're friends. Hermione pulled out her book, flicking to the page she had been on earlier and staring at it furiously. Yes, you and Ron are just friends, said Ginny quietly, glancing furtively between the Yule Ball couple. Harry sat forward, an expression of irritated curiosity on his face. Why defend her, Hermione? Just because you think what she's done is any good? Hermione shuffled in her seat and tucked one leg underneath her, attempting to convey that the conversation was below her now. Because there's more to all this than meets the eye, isn't there? She replied briskly, continuing to read. And it doesn't help when people go around spreading rumors. She looked scalingly at Harry. She's actually did something worthwhile. Oh, let's talk about something else, moaned Ron, nudging Harry now as he saw his friend about to rise to the taunt. What do you think caused the wonderfully miserable atmosphere this Christmas then? That's cheerful, muttered Harry darkly, hunching his shoulders. He thought back to the many times over the holidays he had tried to engage his godfather in conversations when he'd returned, and the shrugs and dismissive comments that had resulted, the hushed voices and whispered conversations that had taken place. And not just with Sirius, and not just when he, Harry, was around. At least that had made him feel slightly better, in a funny sort of way. "There's definitely something that's gone on between Tonks and Lupin," said Ginny, looking thoughtful. "I reckon Mrs. Frobisher had something to do with that, too," she added, looking at Harry. "Does it matter?" asked Hermione crossly, turning over the page in her book. "Of course it does. I mean they were, well, Tonks and Remus." Ginny looked aghast at Hermione's lack of romantic curiosity. Honestly, Ginny looked at Ron and Harry, who were trying to look anywhere but at her, and think about anything but romantic thoughts. "It wasn't as if they were engaged," continued Hermione, looking up at Ginny's indignant expression. "But they loved each other." "Loved?" asked Ron, suddenly becoming interested. "Are you sure?" "See what I mean about rumors?" sighed Hermione, then jerked her head towards the door as the sliding panel was drawn to one side. "Here we are," said Fred, walking in with his robes visibly full of food of a variety of shapes and sizes. "Did you miss us?" He began to pull out some shape-shifting strawberry laces, handing them to Ginny. "Just what we need." "Thanks," said Ginny, watching the long red laces tie and untie themselves in her palm. "Been hours since breakfast," continued George, setting down a few handfuls of every flavor bin packets, gobstoppers and chocolate frogs. "What's up?" he added, looking at the somber faces. "This." Ron practically shouted at his brothers, his annoyance at his Quidditch practice time reigniting in his mind and stabbing his finger at the Wednesday afternoon lesson in disgust. "Honestly, it's as if McGonagall wanted us to lose this term." "And Mrs. Frobisher's back," muttered Harry grumpily. "Brilliant," grinned George, nudging Fred, who pulled out more food from the inside pocket inside his robe and handed it out. "Is it?" muttered Harry again, taking a pumpkin pasty from Fred. "Thanks," he added. "And what's happened at Grimmauld Place?" asked Ron, wondering about Ginny's observations. "Yes, that's what we've been trying to figure out for the last 2 weeks, began Fred, glancing slyly at George. "About what went on at the Orders Ball," continued George, sitting down next to Hermione and nodding with interest at the title of the book sitting on her knees. "SHSHSH," shushed Fred, kicking George sharply in the ankle and looking guilty. Ron and Harry looked at one another at the same time and a told-you-so message was passed silently between them. "But it's been hard, hasn't it, Harry?" The way Sirius had been rather quiet. Ron nodded to Harry, engaging his friend in a mental struggle with his brothers. "Like when you wanted to talk about your parents, Harry, and he just walked off." Harry nodded in agreement, not just to wangle information from George and Fred, but because it had actually happened. "And how everyone went quiet when you asked about Cecilia, Ginny," Harry joined in, another event that had transpired, at Christmas Day lunch. "Come on, out with it," demanded Ron, when the twins exchanged yet another guilty look. "Who us?" said George, feeling the battle slipping from their grip. "Yes, you," replied Ginny. "You were there when they had the meeting." "We know nothing, the Order didn't have a meeting," countered Fred. "No, not an Order meeting," said Ron, looking at Harry. "The meeting, the one that lasted for 2 hours on Christmas Day afternoon?" "Lynching, more like," chipped in Ginny, successfully carrying out a pincer movement on the twins' argument. Fred and George tried to look innocent, a predictably bad move. "The one where they closed the kitchen? Where they must have been so involved with whatever it was they were talking about that they forgot you two clots were present." George sighed, the final breath on behalf of their mortally wounded defense, neatly dispatched with Ron's uppercut comment. "It's for our own good," piped up Hermione, stabbing the argument clean in the chest. "Otherwise wild rumors," she looked pointedly at Ginny, "are about all we'll have got to go on." In a last-ditch attempt, Fred and George's argument crawled back up to its knees, striking sporadically with an isolated memory from the back of Fred's mind. Hasn't Harry got anything to say? He asked, looking at Harry and addressing him in the third person. Didn't Sirius tell him everything when he had that big meeting with Harry just before Christmas dinner? Continued George, aiding the now crippled defense. That's right, exclaimed Ginny, looking at Harry. Dumbledore practically dragged you into the kitchen to speak to Sirius, and you were in there for ages. Harry said nothing, looking around at the 5 questioning faces staring back at him. And we know it must have been about the stuff from the last night, because we heard Dumbledore say that it was a regrettable Christmas Eve, said Hermione, looking sidelong at George. Extendable ears, she confirmed sheepishly. No, said Harry quietly, glancing out of the window. No? Said Ron, incredulously. No, shouted Harry, getting to his feet. The train slowed and he lost his balance, leaving Harry falling towards the window. He hit it sharply, its impact adding to his rising anger. No! He shouted again, louder this time, regaining his balance. You're right, he confirmed angrily, looking at Fred and George. Dumbledore instructed Sirius to tell me everything that had happened the previous evening. But he just stood there. Harry could feel his face growing hot and he was aware of his friend's stunned expressions. He just stood there and said nothing, raged Harry. Nothing. Absolutely nothing to me about whatever it was that had been obviously going on. He stopped suddenly, the problem that had been on his mind clearly off it now, and his expression changed to glum embarrassment. Ginny gave him a look of sympathy. But then he took you into his study that evening again, and told you something then, pressed Ron, clearly shocked at Harry's reaction. You told me you were going because Sirius wanted to tell you something important, he clarified. He was going to, said Harry, sitting back down. But then he couldn't. He looked away from me and told me to go. Satisfied? He looked at Fred and George. George proffered a chocolate frog. Hermione turned and stared at the twins. Okay, they said in unison, burying as a war hero their defense that they had kept alive and kicking for as long as they could. But you can't tell anyone we told you this. George looked uncharacteristically solemn as he looked at 4 expectant faces. We swore we wouldn't tell. Dumbledore? Inquired Harry. Mum. Ron's and Ginny's faces wore expressions of concern at the thought of Molly Weasley's wrath. Even Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance of worry. So no gossiping, continued George, looking at Fred. And you've not got to get jumping to conclusions, either. And Mrs. Frobisher is one cool teacher and we won't have anyone speaking badly of her, will we, George? Right, said George, beaming at the others, she's sound. No insults, he added, throwing a warning glare at Ginny. Ron, Harry, Ginny and even Hermione sat forward, ready to catch every word of the twins' story. Apparently, Sirius had been trying to get rid of her from day one because of her work with Harry and took the party as an opportunity to finish the job. George came straight to the point, glancing at each of them in turn. Called her a lot of really horrible things, got heavy with her. Violent? Gasped Ron, clearly shocked as he gripped the edge of the seat. And where was Snape when this was going on? Interrupted Hermione, annoyed. He went with her, she reminded the twins as she idly fiddled with the pendant on the chain round her neck again. He'd left, apparently. Went to see a man about a dog. All of them, including George, gave Fred an unconvinced look. Okay, we can probably guess, said Harry. Go on, he prompted quickly. Cecilia told Sirius to mind his own business. He bawled at her in front of everyone that ... Their faces were a picture in the meeting. Added Fred, getting sidetracked. Yes, he said she was going to be all our downfalls, said George hastily. But good old Mrs. Frobisher stood up for herself, stared him straight down and gave him what for. Exclaimed Fred, proudly. Good for her, said Hermione quietly. her small crush on Sirius falling hastily to nothing as the twins recounted the tale. That was until he pulled out his wand dash. In front of everyone dash. Burnt her research book dash. Ordered Cretcher to carry out his father's blood deed dash. Called her I can't bring myself to say it, exclaimed George. He touched Fred's arm suddenly as their usual bubbly and carefree natures dissolving in hitherto grave demeanors. They looked at their audience. Hermione had grown pale, her hand to her mouth, clearly shocked. Ginny looked amazed and exchanged glances with a disbelieving Harry. Ron remained fixed, staring at his brothers. Called her what? Insisted Harry forcefully. George took a breath, and looked at Fred. Well, I'm not going to say. He snapped at George before looking at Harry. Come on, insisted Harry, folding his arms. Called her what? Without replying, George took a sheet of parchment and pulled out his wand, angling it like a quill and wrote a word on it. As he turned it to Harry, it began to combust at the corner. Miss Bourne? Asked Harry, clearly lost. What does that mean? He broke off as Hermione sank back in the seat of her carriage, her face pale and tears coursing down her cheeks. Hermione? Harry's tone had changed, and he spoke quietly now. Hermione wiped at her face randomly with her hand and she looked away from him and out onto the harsh, northern landscape being overshadowed now by dark rolling cloud. Eventually she regained her grip and looked at the twins. But she's okay now? She asked, patently ignoring Harry. It took Dumbledore to stop Sirius from going through with it, said George, patting Hermione comfortingly on her forearm. And even then it took some doing. It's no wonder he couldn't speak to you, Harry, said Ron turning to his friend. Nor to any of us the last 2 weeks. And he's normally really chatty to you, Hermione, added Ginny, sidling in a friendly taunt. Hermione narrowed her eyes and giving her a look. Well, if he called her that, I won't be speaking to him ever again, she sniffed, turning to the twins. They nodded in agreement. But what about Remus? Prompted Ginny. Remus? What's he got to do with all of this? Ron cast his sister a look. Yes, she insisted. It doesn't explain why he and Tonks haven't been able to stay in the same room as each other for more than 5 minutes. Or even look at each other, for that matter. Come on, said Harry, giving up on the last mystery and determined now to get to the bottom of this mystery as the twins shifted uncomfortably on the carriage seats. Cecilia went home for Christmas. And Remus went with her. What? Harry was on his feet, the lack of detail from the twins irrelevant from their meaning. They went together? Joined in Ron, like together? Are you blind, Ron? Asked Hermione, through her ebbing sniffs. He spent enough time with her last time Sirius tried to do her in. She finished raggedly, tears building up behind her eyes again. Together. George and Fred nodded as they spoke the word in unison. Well, I'm definitely with Sirius on this one, said Ginny, folding her arms defiantly. Not with the M thing, she gabbled quickly as 4 looks of disbelief bombarded her vision. But she split up Tonks and Remus. She declared defensively. And I don't think it's any of our business, concluded Hermione coolly. Still, Sirius must have had his reasons, said Harry finally. He dash. You can't be serious. Hermione's indignant tone cut through her emotions like acid through grease. Not for attempting to kill her in front of the Order. Not for planning it, all those times we were there. She looked for support now from the twins and Ron, who gave it resolutely. Harry leaned back against the glass, looking out at the clouds that were threatening bitter, winter rain. He doesn't trust her, Hermione, and neither do I. 88,888,888. Cecilia returned to Hagrid's hut the morning that the Hogwarts Express was due into Hogsmeade Station. Her work with the flobberworms had improved the analysis and she had come to collect some more. Hagrid wouldn't be there, she knew, and she had arranged for him to leave another batch of the creatures on the table for her to collect that morning. She opened the door slowly. Fang would be there somewhere, she knew, and though she had never worried about dogs before, she didn't wish to be reckless. No, she thought wryly, she'd done enough of that in the very recent past. Snape had met her in the potions classroom each day that week, and although he had stayed for less time than she would have liked, it had been productive. It was probably for the best anyway that he'd left her to it, though, Cecilia thought as she walked slowly over the floorboards towards the table. The label of reckless could be applied to her feelings that she had when he was near these days, namely that she should follow Snape each time he left. Perhaps she could help him if she followed, be there with him. For him. She had very nearly done so on each occasion that he'd excused himself, but had stopped herself just in time, making herself focus on the repetitive analysis process. Forcing herself to think that this was the best way to help him, as well as Harry, in the long run. And besides, he wouldn't want her following him. The work was dangerous enough as it was. In a stone bowl on Hagrid's rough wooden table, the flobberworms wriggled and writhed, as if alerted to her presence as she neared them. Cecilia smiled, appraising the new additions to her brood. "Perhaps you'd like to try some helianthus leaf tincture this afternoon, eh?" It was growing ever difficult for Cecilia to avoid thinking about the future. No matter how many times she dismissed it, it came bouncing back into her hypothalamus when she was lost in thought. Was it because she felt uncomfortable here now, knowing her hopes before Christmas had been born on her own naive trust? And even though they had agreed to focus on the potion's ingredients, Cecilia had to put it out of her mind time and time again that their time would be reduced dramatically if she knew Lily Potter's exact DNA sequence, because it would narrow down the range of ingredients that they were seeking. The lump underneath the blanket on the chair by the fire moved as she turned to go, and a great presence of mind alerted Cecilia to the necessity of replacing the flobberworm bowl back on the table lest they get knocked out of her hands as the huge frame of Fang bounded over to her. Between licks as he put his huge paws up onto her shoulders, she stroked him thoroughly, massaging him through his fur with her fingertips. "Hello, beautiful," Cecilia fussed. "Have you been a good boy then?" The other thing that was a recurring theme was her status at Hogwarts. Was she to continue to teach? She had to know. The students would be streaming through the gates very soon, and she wanted to be sure of what to say to them should they ask. "Good boy," she said to Fang affectionately as he continued to bathe her in canine saliva. "Hagrid's lucky to have you." Cecilia had settled back, of sorts, although the first couple of days had been difficult. She'd trouble re-engaging with the research, however, and diversions were appealing. Not content with the clear out of her belongings, her brain tried to tempt her back to the library, down to the kitchen, a letter to Tonks, and another to Libby, plan some lessons and read the Mole Studies books. Each one she willed herself to ignore before continuing with the work. She reached up her hand to stop Fang from licking the top of her head, and he bucked, wagging his tail in delight. "I've got no food with me, sweetheart," she told him sadly, petting his long hair round his nape. "Hagrid'll be back soon," she soothed as Fang's tail beat rhythmically against the floor of the hut. At least their work was actually progressing, even if it was unbearably slow. She'd had a long and in-depth discussion with Snape about Petunia Dursley's sample. At least they had something of Harry's blood family, and another one regarding the matrix effects caused by her use of the flobberworms, where they were useful, being, in the loosest sense possible, live test subjects. The downside was that it wasn't an exact match. Another problem was her acquisition of appropriate solvents. The water from the main Hogwarts supply was also magical, and though she still had some from when Nick's kind donation in the summer, it was running out fast now that the analysis rate for the potion ingredients was increasing. At least there was plenty of chlorinated solvent, but that had the effect of interfering with the hormonal to cellular energy transfer that occurred in the wizard samples, and she was unable to detect whether the loss was due to laboratory problems or if it was accurate and her calculations were wrong. Well, she had found time to file and label the hair and blood samples that had been stowed away much earlier. It gave her a sense of control in a funny sort of way, knowing that the only difference between wizards and non-wizards was actually the genetic ability to utilize energy. So really, when she had so many problems to solve, she had no time for distractions. "I'm just getting these here," she said to Fang as he made to lick her face, and, as he thankfully removed his paws from her shoulders, he dashed past Cecilia and towards the door, knocking past her legs with his tail. "Come here," she called as bounced over to the window. "Hagrid won't be happy with me if you get out." "Oh, I don't think Hagrid'll be too upset with the person who has prevented the merpeople from being inconvenienced this summer," said Dumbledore as he stepped in through the door. Stepping lightly into the hut, Cecilia stopped stock still as she watched him move towards her, a look of ethereality on his features, and he dropped his hand to one side and letting Fang nuzzle it. "Professor!" she exclaimed, stepping back as he moved forward, and Cecilia felt her heart soar at his presence. A lot had happened since he had conversed with her via Floo. But whatever his reason for being here, she would be reassured. "Good morning," she continued, putting down the flobber worms. "Are you looking for me?" Dumbledore nodded, taking a glimpse into the bowl that Cecilia had set back down on the table, raising his eyebrows in interest. "Indeed it is a good morning," Dumbledore continued, flicking into existence a huge bone which he held down for Fang. The dog secured it between his powerful jaws, growling in visceral delight. "Your work is going well, I believe." Cecilia nodded. Getting there, she thought, though there are some minor teething problems. "And I'm sure you are aware that the students are due to return today." He looked at Cecilia without expression, and Cecilia felt herself nodding again. "How do you intend to explain your presence here?" Cecilia was about to speak, then stopped. Normally Dumbledore asked the leading questions, implying the correct answers that you're really stupid if you missed. But not this time. This time Dumbledore had thrown the ball back in her court. Silence reigned as she struggled to think. "Don't." Words of instruction littered her mind like brown leaves falling from trees as she suppressed emotion and over-analysis. "Don't think. Say what you feel. What you think is for the best." When I was a Mole Studies teacher last term, that seemed to work, she found herself saying, returning Dumbledore's neutral expression as she brushing Fang's drooling head away from her ankle. "Severus is delighted with your progress, I have no doubt you are aware. However, I could not compel you to remain if you feel you wish to terminate our contract." The depths of the night had her contemplating the situation, keeping her from sleep as she thought and thought. But each time she had came to the same conclusion, the same that she had come to 6 months ago, even with the added considerations this time. Cecilia shook her head. "No." "Then carry on with what you're doing, Mrs. Frobisher. Develop Harry's potion with Severus, following his guidance, and teach Mole Studies." Cecilia beamed, kneeling to fuss a very contented Fang. She would be able to teach again. She could teach science, she could teach history. She could teach the Universal Link. Could she teach the Universal Link? "I've got one question," said Cecilia, looking up at Dumbledore. "Of course." He inclined his head in a slow nod and Cecilia swallowed. "Am I restricted in my choice of material for my classes?" Cecilia left the question hanging in midair. Dumbledore's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. Shaking his head, the headmaster of Hogwarts slowly got to his feet, his expression breaking into a small smile. "Then we have a deal," he concluded, encompassing her hand in his and shaking it thoroughly. "Welcome back, Mrs. Frobisher, welcome back. 88,888,888. 2 weeks after shaking hands with her employer, Cecilia Frobisher was beginning to wish that she hadn't. Well, nothing was actually bad, but it was beginning to feel that nothing was going right at all. The problems that had worried her in her first week at Hogwarts had grown increasingly worse. Each time Cecilia felt she might be getting somewhere, it turned out to be beset with problems. It was like trying to navigate a quagmire, Cecilia analogized grimly, without knowing the best way out. Or even if there was an out. Her lessons had been reduced to 14 a week, including one on a Saturday, and she and Snape had decided that the best place for her to continue with the work to prevent them from raising suspicion was in the Mole Studies classroom. There at least has been a positive step, although she couldn't claim credit for the inspiration. In fact, it had been a comment from Seamus Finnegan, who, having chanced on her in the Mole Studies classroom the second day back, before their next lesson. "So all these Mole things we've learned," he'd begun, gesturing towards a timetable. "Can you let us know what we'll be doing this term? Must be important if we're with you Saturday morning." Not sure yet, Seamus," she'd said, putting down a tray of equipment that she'd moved from the potions classroom, and notice his eyes straight to it. "But rest assured, you'll be able to use your wand," she'd smiled. "I knew it," Seamus had proclaimed. "There's no way Dumbledore'd have wasted our time with boring old Mole stuff if it hadn't got anything to do with our OWLs." And with that, he waved his wand idly towards the glassware and grinned, knowingly. And Cecilia had thought, why not? They wouldn't know otherwise what she was teaching them, if she described it in terms of learning about moles, and it'd certainly speed up the analysis time. And explain why she had all of this stuff set up. The lesson plans she'd drawn up were both creative and inspired, allowing her to access the wavelengths of the spells while explaining more about science. More than she dreamed of. And she would not need to worry with too many meetings with Harry. Harry. Well, she'd been sure Dumbledore would have spoken to him too, made him aware how important it was, but from the wide berth he and the other children had been giving her, it made Cecilia wonder. And now, on a grey and miserable Saturday evening, as rain beat against the glass, recalculating the wavelength and frequencies of the waves from the second week's worth of Mole Studies lessons at the back of the classroom, an ever-increasing feeling of melancholic disaffection was beginning to press on her chest. Most of the results worked as spells, and some corresponded to the results from the Flobber worms. But not all, and not consistently enough. Why wasn't it working? And even though the young wizards in Hogwarts were appearing to treat her as they had always done, were they? Did they know about the work? Were they humoring her? Was her secret written on her forehead for all to read? Were the sporadic taunts from various Slytherin students genuinely taunts at their belief that she was a squib, or did they know she was a mole? Were they benign, or was she likely to find her room turned upside down again? At least she burned the most incriminating stuff, but there were still things like mole money and a picture of Freya to find. 454 nanometers? It had been twice that with the spell courtesy of Angelina 2 days ago. And with the Flobber worms. But there was no correlation. Why couldn't she make it match? For the third time that night a boiling tube bought it as she threw it in anger at the floor and shrieked in frustration. Why? Why? She knew she shouldn't care about the children, but their behavior, however slightly worse it had become since Christmas, was beginning to affect her lessons in the way it had never done before. Anxiety and unease had begun to trickle down the back of her neck before each lesson had begun, like cold water. Cecilia glanced at the microscope upon which she had positioned a beam of torchlight. The torch was balanced on a book with a makeshift tray box holding a slit in order to concentrate the light onto the glass. Had it moved? No. The angle differential was still right, 60 degrees. Cecilia checked the lenses and the height of the stage away from the eyepiece. All good. She turned and began to unscrew the next jar and tipped some of the contents into her hand. Dried doxies read the label, and Cecilia examined the creatures curiously. Very definitely dead. Thank heavens, she thought as she examined their long limbs with belled fists at the end and long, very sharp-looking teeth. And she'd labored on in the classroom, with first, third, fourth, sixth, fifth, second years remaining bright, planning and delivering interesting and dynamic lessons. But not with confidence. The students were doing something for her, Cecilia told herself, conveniently ignoring the outburst Ginny Weasley had come out with the day before. Challenging behavior, as Ofsted would have described it. She had to remain focused. Cecilia turned round, curling her hand around the dead doxies in her hand. No one. She turned back to the doxy, which had slightly disintegrated in her hand, walked over to the desk she had maneuvered next to the table with the microscope, and slid the next ingredient from the potions cupboard onto a watch glass before padding briskly across the flagstone floor to the hearth. The cough Cecilia knew she'd heard had come from near the door. She took a step in its direction. Hello. Silence. Concentrate, she told herself firmly. Once she'd got the next solution on the go, then at least another couple of her precious flobberworms could add some more detail to the already rich mass of information. At least the effects had been the same for the creatures. The magical ingredients had begun to selectively shut down mitochondria in the worm's primitive endocrine system in exactly the same way each time. That was the link, it just needed perfecting. And they were only up to D. Shattering the silence, a thunderous rattling sound that appeared to be coming from near the microscope equipment made Cecilia lurch in shock. She dropped the cauldron she was holding, and water spilled across the flagstone floor as she spun around, giving a shriek.